Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Claire Byrne, and I'm the Community Manager for RSA US. So on behalf of Lina, Sarah, and myself and the wider RSA US team, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this month's US Salon, telling the stories of transformational change. So before we get started, I'd like to give you a little bit of a background on the RSA, RSA US, and cover some ground rules about today's event. So founded in the UK, the RSA stands for the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, and has been uniting people and ideas to resolve the challenges of our time since about 1754. So today, the Society exists as an international fellowship-driven think tank committed to providing an independent platform for research and debate on contemporary issues and topics. Of the roughly 30,000 fellows spread out around the globe, about 1,100 live and work here in the United States, including Lina. And RSA US exists to coordinate fellowship activities in the United States with an aim towards moving the needle on addressing the inequities of our society. So before I turn things over to Lina and Sarah and introduce our guest speakers for today, I'd like to cover a few ground rules about today's event. So today's event is being recorded, like I mentioned when you were all joining our session today. The chat is available for you to raise points of clarification. No question is a silly question. We really welcome your feedback and your questions throughout this session. And most importantly, we are all coming from different backgrounds, different cultures, different countries. This is a very global event and a global topic. So please don't hesitate to ask if something is unfamiliar to you. And also saying that, please be respectful in the language that you choose to use throughout the event, whether it be when you're off mute or in the chat. So use language that your mother, your mum, or as we'd say in Ireland, your mam would approve of. And then lastly, we will use the chat to collate any questions for the kind of Q&A towards the end of the event. But if something urgent, just raise a hand, or you can chat with me directly via the RSA US events account on this Zoom event. And so that's all the kind of the nitty gritty from me. I just wanted to introduce our speakers for today. So I have Lina and Sarah with us today, and Lina Srivastava is a strategist, advocate, and producer who catalyzes and amplifies social impact, social movements, and systems change by combining technology, culture, and art. She creates narrative-based social change initiatives with NGOs, global institutions, and independent media creators, combining field experience and direct service with skills in media and audience engagement, expertise in human-centered and community-centered design, and a focus on community leadership. So she is a founder of the Center for Transformational Change, a global impact platform to cultivate community power to build just futures. She previously founded CIEL, Creative Impact and Experience Lab, an innovation studio working at the intersection of human rights, international development, and narrative strategies. A former attorney and former nonprofit executive director, Lina has worked with organizations such as the ICRC, UNICEF, UNESCO, the IRC, the New Humanitarian Film Aid, and the Gender Avengers Future projects, and on social engagement campaigns for several award-winning documentaries and immersive media projects. Lina is a Fulbright specialist on the US State Department's American Film Showcase roster. She's a faculty at large in the Masters of Design for Social Innovation program and faculty at the Masters of Products of Design program at SVA. She's been a Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center Fellow, a recipient of a Rockefeller Foundation Leadership Grant, a Rockwood Institute Just Films Fellow, a Boehm Media Fellow, and of course, a Fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts. And Lina is a graduate of New York University School of Law. So welcome to Lina. I'm just going to spotlight her there so that you can make sure you're all able to see Lina. And also welcoming Sarah to our event today. Sarah Owusu is an award-winning organizational development and innovation specialist with a passion for leading transformation. Her focus is organizational culture, systems change, and creating the conditions for dialogue and breakthrough conversations. So her approach is participatory and human-centered, allowing individuals, teams, and organizations to tackle complexity with pragmatism and authenticity. She started her career at British Airways, leading a company-wide culture change program focused on employee engagement and improving customer satisfaction. And after leaving London in about 2014, she established a pioneering organizational development and strategy consultancy in Mozambique, with her work recognized with the 2014 Women for Africa Award for Inspirational Women of the Year and the International Organizational Development Network naming her Emerging New OD Practitioner in 2018. So she now applies this expertise to the innovation space, co-founding the boutique innovation consultation called Ink. In 2019. which is committed to democratizing innovation by making it practical, locally relevant, and putting innovation tools in the hands of everyday people so they can solve their own challenges, everyday challenges. And Ink.Dot works with organizations such as ABSA Bank, UNDP, Youth Business International, Mozilla Foundation, the World Bank, but to name a few. And lastly, she is also the co-founder of two storytelling platforms, We Will Lead Africa and Collateral Benefits. Both initiatives center on shifting narratives and bringing African voices to the global conversation about the future of Africa and the world. So welcome to both of you. Lots of experience there and lots to talk about, I'm sure. So I'm going to hand it over to yourself, Lina, to introduce the topic for the day and to talk a little bit more about your work. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Claire. It's really an honor to be with you. It's an honor to be with the RSA USA. I did a workshop around this topic with the RSA in London a few years ago. It was one of the last times I traveled before the pandemic. So it's good to be with you all, even virtually. So the topic today that we're talking about, that Sarah and I will be exploring, is telling the stories of transformational change. And I've been thinking about this topic of transformational change. I've been thinking about the topic of narrative for about 20 years and the application of narrative and narrative strategies in all its forms to human rights advocacy and rights-based development for quite a long time. And in 2013, a woman named Parween Rahman, who was working with an organization called the Orangi Pilot Project in Pakistan, she had been doing some extremely effective work with informal settlements with the Orangi Pilot Project, and was working with these communities on access to water rights, access to land rights, and such. And she was assassinated, unfortunately, in March of 2013. And this sort of sent shock, this sent shock waves through the development sectors in South Asia, and particularly in the Rockefeller Foundation, which had been one of their founders. And Nancy McPherson at the Rockefeller Foundation, who was heading up all of monitoring and evaluation there, sort of came to me and said, Parween Rahman had done this amazing work, but there's been no documentation of her own leadership. She was so involved and so committed to the work that she hadn't actually documented it. And this is something that we had found over and over again, right? That leaders on the ground, in social movements, in development, in rights, were doing this incredible work on the ground and weren't being recognized, number one, or number two, didn't have time or space to tell their own stories. And so we decided to create this project, the Transformational Change Leadership Project, to start thinking about how do we understand the kind of leadership it takes to catalyze transformational change in and from community. And it was a sort of a 3-year inquiry, at the end of which I ended up releasing a framework called the Transformational Change Leadership Project, which is available at tcleadership.org. And it's a reflection tool. It's a tool that is meant for people across the development and rights and social impact sectors to think about their own leadership process. So the theory here is that, anyone can be a transformational change leader. You just have to be deeply committed to it over time. So the framework, it's laid out at the website, but there's 7 characteristics. We sort of looked at 400 different organizations or people or such around the world. I worked with the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, England, to sort of do a survey of all these people who are doing incredible work in and from community, and start reading their stories and digesting their stories. And then from that, created this framework. And what you need to catalyze transformational change is 7 things. It was like seven different characteristics that we kept seeing over and over again coming up. The first one is vision, right? You need to have a vision for what you want to change, what you want to transform. And vision can be grand. It can be sort of in the millions. It can be global. It can be worldwide, or it can be in one neighborhood. But it has to be sort of like, you have to understand where you're going and where you want your community to go. Number 2 is empathy. but it's not empathy in that sort of Silicon Valley way that we've sort of like, if you put on a pair of goggles, or if you like, you hear somebody's story, all of a sudden you have empathy. It's about lived experience. It's about really understanding being of the community, or understanding, having this long-standing relationship with the community, that you understand what the political, social, and cultural contexts are. The third one is perseverance, right? It's about making sure that you're in it for the long haul and that you're adapting constantly to different circumstances. Then there's risk, sort of taking risks, whether they're physical, which is often the case, or reputational or financial. And then there's community centeredness, like you have to be in and of community and center the community's needs. And then there's collaboration, right? And we're going to talk about this you and I will talk about this quite a bit, is collaboration. You have to collaborate across sectors, across different organizations, different industries. And the last one is mobilization, right? You have to mobilize people to get your vision implemented. So these are the 7 things that we kept hearing about. And so we created this framework, and then we proved the framework through the stories of these transformational leaders. And so when you go to the framework, you'll read their stories. And we were very committed to making sure that we were highlighting and elevating the narratives of people, the stories of people. So this is not data-driven, right? Or rather numerical data-driven. This is driven by the case studies, the stories, the frameworks, the evidence that communities themselves are putting out there. And it is meant to elevate the people who are doing the work and often don't get the recognition, right? And they're often, it's an imperfect term, but they're often people of color. They're often communities of color who are not getting the funding, the recognition, the media spread. And so it was very important to us to sort of put that out into the world, and to put it into the world of donors and social enterprises and bilaterals and multilaterals. Like we wanted to, so we ended up workshopping it around the world until the pandemic happened, right? So we released this in 2018, 2020, everything stopped. And so in 2021, I decided to shut down my last company. And I'd been planning this for a while, and I started the Center for Transformational Change in September of last year, and it is based on these principles. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that company does when we have our chat together, Sarah. But I wanted to throw it to you so you can talk a little bit about your own work on transformation and narrative.
Thanks so much, Lina, and thanks everyone for being here. It's super an honor to be in a virtual space with you all. Lina, like you're just taking the words straight out of my mouth. And I think we kind of found that when we were connecting before this session as well, that there's so many overlaps in the work that you do. You heard in the very long, it sounded very profound introduction bio about me, that the work that I do is based here in Johannesburg, South Africa, but our organization works across the world, but particularly focused in Southern Africa, is in the innovation space. So we have a boutique consultancy called Ink. And then I run a couple of storytelling platforms. And the part of transformation that I really wanted to hone in on here to start off with is this idea of narrative as technology, or narrative technology. And part of the reason, I use the word technology really deliberately, because I think often there's an assumption when we're talking about transformation, or particularly in the innovation space, that innovation is something shiny and sleek and maybe made out of steel. I caught myself the other day, when you're talking about Silicon Valley, Lina, I caught the words falling out of my mouth, cynical valley, as opposed to Silicon Valley. But yeah, so I think there are these assumptions about what technology is, and really what I try to uplift in a lot of my work is, I guess, the power of a more organic or kind of body temperature kind of tools and technologies, right? And by that, I mean conversations, I mean dialogue, I mean the words and the stories that we tell, the questions that we ask. And so really a key tool in the work that I do and the work that we do at Ink. Is about bringing people together to tell their stories, to imagine different futures together in really participatory ways. And I really think that the quality of our conversations is the quality of our results. And ultimately the world that we're able to craft depends on us being able to tell stories together. And so when it comes to innovation, when it comes to transformation, I think the interest that I really have around this is about, like, what are the stories that we tell ourselves? What are the stories that we tell ourselves about each other? What do we believe is possible or not possible? And also, like, who gets to innovate? Who gets to be an innovator? Who gets to be at the center of the conversation when we talk about innovation and creating the future that we want? So maybe I'll pause there as a bit of introduction about how I kind of relate to the ideas of narrative.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I think our first question that we wanted to discuss was, I guess, the role of leadership, right, in transformational change or in transformation. And I've been thinking about this question, quite a bit, obviously, and developed a framework around it. But, I feel like there's a recurring problem, like you just said: who gets to tell the story? Who gets to innovate? Who gets to sort of make the decision? And I've been doing a lot of work lately, like a lot of my work over the last 20 years has centered on questions around forced displacement, like refugee rights and migrant rights and climate justice, and where those things meet, and gender inequality, sort of like this mix, this intersecting mix of rights and development issues. And, one of the things that has been a constant, I think, is that people who are doing the work on the ground, on the quote unquote ground, are the ones who know they have the lived experience, they have the knowledge, they have the expertise. It is not recognized as expertise. It is not given credence. It's not supported, in that way. And we keep seeing over and over again, sort of headquarters, like Western headquarters, getting the funding or sort of making the decisions around where resources go, or what frameworks are adopted, what models are supported. And more, as I look at our intersecting crises of, like, massive refugee flows and climate, sort of climate collapse and such, it is the adaptation strategies and the innovation strategies and the perseverance of people who are closest to the issue that needs to be given, that we need to be paying attention to. We need to support it. We need to get away, sort of get out of the way of people doing this work. That doesn't mean we don't have responsibility or a role to play, those of us who are sort of in a more either Western context or, things like that. Those of us who are, like, on this call, for example, either some of us are close to the issue, some of us are remote from the issue, but proximity to the issue is extremely important. And understanding leadership as something that is about lived experience, as about proximity, that's about understanding. I love I love what you said about body temperature, that there's something organic, that there's something lived and raw and real about it. That is a form of expertise. That's a form of leadership, and that needs to be elevated, right? And so a lot of the work, my company is only 6 months old at this point, but a lot of the work that we've done so far is about making sure that we're elevating, not in that kind of bottom up kind of way, but in that lived experience, in that body temperature kind of way. Who gets to tell the story? Who gets to shape and frame the story of what's happening on the ground in terms of climate change, like the consequence of that, or displacement, or gender inequality? Like, who gets to tell that story? And story and leadership are so seamed for me. Like, I can't think about them separately anymore. And I don't think about leadership as people. I think about it in terms of community. Like, I don't think about it as individual people anymore. I was giving a workshop a few years ago in the Republic of Georgia to a bunch of, like, teenagers, multi-ethnic, multiple languages, and they came together to do this transformational change leadership workshop together. And each one, at the end of it, we had a 2-day workshop. All the young women sort of came up to me. They're like, I didn't know I could be a leader. I didn't know that we could work together to be leaders. I thought it was the president. I thought it was the head of, the company over there. I didn't realize it was me. And, that kind of change is something that I want to see that change in terms of how we think about what leadership is and the role of people's experiences and stories.
Yeah, I'll jump in and riff off of that. And when you talk about leadership as community, 100%, that really resonates. I think also leadership as no longer being, or it's no longer relevant, the type of leadership which is this individualistic Lone Ranger out there at the front waving the flag. It's actually, in fact, that's dangerous. And what we need much more of is this kind of collective leadership. And, of course, I'm biased in this sense, but I think that that's a type of leadership that really is at the surface in a lot of African countries and cultures, and is something that we can teach the rest of the world a lot about. It also, one part that you speak about these like intersecting crises or existential crises that we're facing as humanity at the moment, I think Mozambique is a really good example of, it's kind of a microcosm, right? Like there is a conflict going on in the north of the country. There is a huge refugee crisis and many million, thousands of displaced people. There's resource extraction happening, and then there's a donor community that's kind of coming in and trying to place their resources in wherever's the hottest topic at that particular moment. So it's interesting for us, obviously working in the innovation space and social innovation space in that context, really trying to uplift what you're describing, Lina, as this lived experience. And I don't mean to paint a stark picture of Mozambique, because the other side of the story is that there is so much ingenuity and brilliance of everyday people everywhere who are doing amazing things despite, right? And so thinking about innovation in that context as how do we uplift that and resource those types of movements and really build on what people already know for themselves that they need. And then I think lastly, I'll say that maybe on a kind of more global scale, I think if we're looking for where we should begin, in general, when it comes to transformation or innovation, if we're looking for where to begin, in general, the good places to look are in the places where people's voices have previously been excluded, right? So look to, for example, people with disabilities, to how we might create a world that is more accessible, right? Look to Black women who will tell you about like where our space is unsafe and how might we create a more just world. So, I think it's like, how do we bring those conversations in? Because in fact, really and truly, there's so much insight there, and they're telling us about, I'm one, we're telling you about exactly where the cracks are and what's not working, right?
Yeah.
So
exactly, because I think there's so much insight and knowledge through the lived experience of people, right? And the people, as you said, the ones who've been formerly, sort of previously excluded and continue to be excluded, right? And so, a lot of the work that I've been doing lately is, sort of in the questions around like decolonization or anti-racism or things, like those are frameworks that I think that need to be integrated, very, very deeply into the work that we do. You can't think about transformation of a community or a society or the globe without thinking about the people who have been borne the brunt of geopolitical sort of policies that they haven't constructed. You can't think about transformation anymore without understanding their experiences or their insights or learning, from them or from us, right? As depending on where we sit in the spectrum of power. And I think that's when I think about leadership, I think about the people who understand the problem the best. It's like that's a form of leadership that we continually exclude. If we keep centering our solutions in people who are sort of remote from the issues or the communities, we're not going to get very far. Yeah. So what's our second question?
Yeah, and maybe we'll just do this because I think it's important that we give some space to the rest of you all to join in on having a chat with us. But we have one here about what's a principle for transformation. Like if you were to offer your one tip, as if there's one, but if you were to offer one principle for people leading transformation, what would you offer, Lina?
Yeah, so I mean, it's, as you said, there's no one principle. There are many roads to transformation. Like I think, I've created a quote unquote framework, but it's a framework that's very open-ended, right? So there's no one path that you need to take to get to a transformed community or transformed for shared prosperity, for justice. But the one thing I would say, because we're talking about telling the stories of that, investing in narrative as a technology or investing in narrative as a form of data is something that I want to see elevated, right? So aside from the 7 characteristics I talked about, vision, empathy, perseverance, etc., that we all need to do, we need to be listening. Listening is a technology. Listening is an active form of leadership. Listening is, it's an essential part of transformation. And I think we need to do a lot more active listening and learning and digesting. And then the other thing is that, the sense of urgency that is being brought on by the pandemic, by sort of the very large refugee flows anywhere from Ukraine to Afghanistan to everything, or climate. These are very urgent things, and we actually don't have the time to be impatient, if that makes any sense. Like we have to be very, very deep and thorough. We cannot, I think, when we think about innovation and technology, we think about solutions and tools, as opposed to what is, sort of community, what is collaboration, what is the movement that we need to be catalyzing. And so, the way I've constructed the company that I just launched, like there's 3 things that we do, right? There's 3 methodologies that we use. One is social impact strategy, like really trying to figure out how do we take stories and make them actionable? How do we get people to commit to a particular kind of like movement and catalyze that? The second one, and you and I overlap here, is what we call catalytic conversations. It's dialogue, and it's dialogue based on lived experience, shared experiences. And the third one is we're trying to, what I call, build the narrative infrastructure for social change and for social transformation. How do you create a body of story that shows what transformational change means, and how do we learn from it? So those are sort of the 3 things that I'm investing in, like with this company. That's not one principle, those are 3 principles. But I would just say, because of this, narrative, stories, and not storytelling in a advertising kind of sense. Storytelling can be propaganda. It can be messaging that is just like watered down. I'm talking about actual raw stories that people are telling about what their context is, what their situations are. That's extremely important.
And you again took the words out of my mouth. The one thing that I would offer would be about slowing down, right? And yes, that is insanely hard when everything feels like it is so urgent, and we have to take action. But I think, our tendency towards rushing or producing or quick wins, I think, is really just making us perpetuate the same issues that we have been creating in the past. And so this level of complexity really requires depth. Innovation requires deep understanding, which is what you were speaking to, Lina. Not an exhaustive understanding, right? Like we also need to move to action, but it does require that kind of depth. And so, yeah, that would be my one tip: is slow down, take a breath.
Exactly, which is hard. I mean, it's, as you said, there's an urgency to it. There's also a sense of I think especially with the pandemic, there's been this sense of like, almost like fatalism, right? I see a lot of people. I wrote a piece last year called The Act of Creating Hope. And I don't love the word hope. I just never have. It feels very tepid in a lot of ways to me. And that's how I opened the essay. But, those of us who are in the innovation or creative, circles of creativity, communities of practice where we use art or technology or, things like this, I feel like we have an obligation now to start manufacturing hope. Indy Johar, who I think is an RSA fellow, who's in England, writes and talks about industries of hope. Like, this is going to be extremely important as we sort of look at societal collapse and intersecting societal collapse, that it's our job, right, to be manufacturing hope and vision and, things like this. And it's really hard. And, one of the things that you and I talked about before we set this talk up was how hard it is as women of color to do this, right? Like there's a sense of, we have the lived experience, we have the knowledge, we have all of this, and it is so hard to get resourced. It's so hard to get platformed, and even when we build our own platforms, it's really hard. And so I think, building these sort of industries of hope, it is collective, but, we need support to do this. We need, especially as women of color, especially Black women from Africa, really need the support to be able to sort of elevate the stories and be platformed. So I think that's the other takeaway I would want people to know about.
Maybe we can move. We were going to put you into some breakout rooms for just a few moments. Maybe we'll give 7-ish minutes or so before coming back. And our invitation to you all is to, of course, say hello to each other from across the virtual space. But then maybe you want to talk a little bit about, within your contexts, how have you catalyzed transformation? And then when we come back together, we would love to hear some insights from you and, of course, take any questions that you might have. So I think Claire's going to send you off.
I'm going to wing you into a breakout room. There's about kind of 4 people in each breakout room. So it would be great for you to talk about the prompt that Sarah suggested there, which I popped in the chat. Obviously, we won't record this part of the event itself, so I'll pause recording, but I hope you have a really fruitful conversation, and I'll send around a reminder when we're due to come back to general discussion. So enjoy, and I hope you have a good chat. Welcome back. It's nice to have you all back in our main room or plenary, main session, whatever you want to call it. I hope you had some really fruitful conversations. And I'm just going to hand it over to Lina and Sarah to kind of facilitate your feedback and kind of see what conversations you had there. So thank you so much.
Great. There we are. So how would you like to do this, Sarah?
I'd love to hear from people. I know we scared a few people away with the breakout rooms, I think, but that means that we're a small group and we have time to actually hear people's voices. So what did you chat about? And do you have questions for us? I guess you can put your hands up if you want to share out loud. And feel free to just come off mute. Tell us what our previous conversation sparked, or tell us what you got up to in your breakout rooms.
Yeah, it'd be really great to hear some feedback. And in the meantime, maybe Lina and Sarah, you could share some of what you observed or some of what you kind of noticed in the chat. That would be really helpful.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually going to exercise, I know I'm not the moderator here, but I'm going to exercise moderator's privilege and just call on Serena because Serena and Sally, because we had a great conversation in our little breakout room. And there you are, Serena.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Really great to be with you. It's been a wonderful session so far. So my name's Serena Abassi, and I kind of work kind of in this field already, but I kind of brand it more as kind of general kind of inclusion work. And I was saying, well, we were talking, so I was in a group with the lovely, I think it was Sally that I was with. Sorry if it was, wasn't it? And Sally works in public sector, if I remember correctly, and I kind of work across sector. And we were speaking about, ultimately, principles of leadership also require a willingness to get things wrong. So, really kind of dismantling that ego that we might have at senior leadership level. And we were discussing how, Lina was saying that obviously the work that she does is about societal change. And, my business is primarily around businesses. So I'm not kind of like working with governments or anything like that, or lobbyists. And I was basically saying that the business is essentially a microcosm for society. So if you can, affect change, within a business, I like to think, and that's what keeps me going, you can affect it more broadly within society as well. That's all I wanted to say, or we wanted to say.
Thank you. I love that, the notion of getting things wrong, right? Not in that sort of Mark Zuckerberg Facebook kind of like, make things fast and break things, or whatever his motto was. Oh, just awful. But the ability to sort of say, we're going to try, we're going to experiment, we're going to do things in a different way. And if we fail, there's learning there, right? And taking your ego out. And, I was talking to a large NGO a couple of weeks ago, a very large international body with many, many different country offices. And one of the things that they said is like, we are so afraid of not getting something right. And their consequence of not getting something right, quote unquote, is dire, right? Because they're a humanitarian organization and things like that. But the ability to sort of step back and say, we're going to try something different, and we're not going to have expectations around the outcomes, especially in terms of like narrative or technology deployment or things like that. You can't experiment on populations. I've heard that before, where I'm sure you have too, Sarah, where people are like, oh, we're going to deploy this, new technology on poor populations in like East Africa and figure out what we want to do. Like, I've heard that so many times. That's unethical. However, the ability to sort of say, we might get this wrong, and not have ego around it. I think, Serena, I think that's a great point.
Yeah, that's a really important point that you make, right, around experimentation, like giving ourselves the leeway to get things wrong, because we inevitably will, because we're doing a lot of this stuff for the first time, but then also being really clear on how apologies get made, how accountability is held through some of those processes. And I think, I've worked, you heard, I've worked in British Airways, which is like super safety culture, because again, like the risks are so high. And then in parallel, in a lot of social justice organizations where, again, the risks are really high, like it's people's lives that are at risk in those spaces. And so there can be a real fear around experimentation or getting things wrong. And I think we kind of have to tease those things apart, right? Like there are the moments where we're, can we prototype in a safe space? Can we kind of test in a smaller setting where the risk isn't as high, as opposed to,
Yeah. And what did your group talk about? I'd love to hear from someone in one of the breakout rooms.
Renee, Michelle, do you want to share anything? Michelle gave a great example around starting at the level of just what I do in my family.
Oh, hi. I was in a break room with Renee, who very humbly stated many different ways in which she's activating change. But I think one of the main topics that came out of that for me was reflecting on where exactly you want to make an impact. I think starting with change, I think we all kind of have big eyes and we see many areas where we have interest or we see a need for change. And I think as you step into kind of becoming a more refined, if I can say that, leader, a more concentrated leader, it's about really seeing and I'm borrowing Renee's words here, but seeing where you kind of get more returns or where you see the greatest impact happening, and kind of mobilizing other people and mainly yourself to focusing on that area.
Yeah, that's great. Anyone else?
Hi, I was just going to say, oh, thanks, Michelle. But she didn't speak about her own transformational impact. And she had shared such a beautiful example, actually, of what she's doing in her own home, where she's just implemented recycling, and the way that she's doing it with so much passion that people are actually even going to the bin and commenting how, about how passionate she is. And so it's just created change within the household, which is what Sarah was saying now, starting small. We were just speaking now about a microcosm of something. So even your home is mirroring exactly that. So yeah, I find it difficult to speak about where I've impacted in my personal journey. So that's what I was sharing with Michelle. But I think that through the different platforms I've been engaging over the last few weeks, a lot of what's come to the fore is, this practicing of reflexivity and kind of looking at what you're doing and getting honest feedback. And I think just really finding that space within yourself. Am I still true to the cause? Am I still being authentic in what I'm doing? And I do find it difficult, but I love the fact that the spaces I find myself in, it just pulls me right back to this question, exactly like this evening. So thanks for that.
Wonderful. I'm gonna highlight two things that you both said. You talked about constellations of impact, which I think is incredible. And I think that, when we think about how we catalyze transformation, I often say that I'm allergic to the term scale, because often we're like, okay, how do you scale that? What's the scale of this? Like, how do you make this bigger? And often you don't need to make things bigger. You need to make them deeper. You need to make them, sort of, and you have to see where within your own work or your life, where you can affect transformation, right? And I think that the notion of I think too often when we talk about how we make social change, we put it back on the individual. It's like, okay, stop using your straws and start, things like that. But those choices do make a difference, right? And I think that thinking about how you move out from your constant, sort of the different constellations of change that you can create, I think is a beautiful idea. And then also, yeah, the notion of like microcosms, like where do you think about, how do you think about where you fit in on this spectrum of privilege, power, where you can affect change. And it is about, if we're like thinking about the different ways you can make change, there are many, many, many paths. And then, yes, Sergio was talking about experimentation. Did you want to say that out loud, Sergio?
No, not really. I'm just, going back to one of the things that you mentioned, and Sarah collaborated on it, which was the need of bringing people into the conversation. And because the type of work that I do, and just to clarify, I'm a colleague of Sarah at Inkdot, so I would probably be kind of biased. I'm saying this. That's why I don't want to elaborate more. But my question would be related to, how do you actually bring those people into the conversation? Okay, they are so so key to the experimentation, to getting things, to get stuff done wrong, so they can actually learn. But they are the ones who have to do it, right? Yeah. But most of the times, on projects, on real projects, the decision makers and the leadership are not willing to follow this approach. So, just launching this consideration out there.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge question. I think we could do an entire session on that, and how I've done it in my work, and also how I've seen it done, where you get senior leadership or whoever's resourcing to get on a more experimental agenda, or in terms of more listening. I'll say, just to tie this up to go full circle to this topic, is that often when I have worked with either social movements or organizations or communities, it is within the frame of narrative that you can experiment most. It's the sort of the communications department, or it's the sort of the filmmakers or the artists who can experiment more. It's like, people who are doing pure activism or pure service delivery or things, it's hard for them to innovate. It's hard for them often, without massive, impacts on the communities they're working with. So often you'll see it come out like, new frames tested through people who are investing more in narrative strategies, because the cost benefit analysis here is a little bit less dire, shall we say. So that's, again, yeah, it's a huge question, but I'll just tie up. I know we're like running out of time. So I'll just say that, investing in narrative means that you're also investing in the ability to experiment and innovate a little bit more. Yeah.
That's a nice way to kind of come full circle, as you said, with what we've been talking about. And what I wanted to do, because I'm just conscious of time and everyone's time, and it's probably lunchtime or coming up to dinner time for a lot of folks, is just maybe to have a think about what maybe key takeaway or action item or learning that everyone is leaving this event with, or what they would like to put into practice after this discussion. And feel free to pop that in the chat. It would be really great for us to see what your kind of key takeaway is from this event. And we'll kind of read through some of them before I officially close everything up. But I just wanted to extend a huge thank you to both of our speakers, Lina and Sarah, today. It was really great to have access to your experience, to your knowledge, your insights for just shy of an hour. So thank you so much. And your time is precious for everybody. And thank you to our attendees for making today's event and participating in our breakout rooms and our chats. It was really great to hear about your own lived experiences. And I just want to see there if anyone popped any useful takeaways in the chat before we
so I'm going to give one offer, is that so the Transformational Change Leadership Framework is free to use for anyone. It's Creative Commons licensed. The only things you can't remix are the photographs, like those are copyrighted, but all the text, all the frameworks, there's a learning guide, there's a sort of an activity guide. So you can use it with your organizations, with your communities, with your community-based groups. And it's free, as long as you just credit me and the Rockefeller Foundation, do what you will with it. So it's at tcleadership.org or at my company. Download the guide and just and sort of reflect on your own leadership potential. So it's a gift out to the world.
Thank you so much, Lina. And just for everybody who's attended the event, I will be sending around a follow-up email, so I will share all those resources with you. And I see, Rebecca, there that you posted a question, and thank you so much for reaching out. I'm sorry we don't have time to address it today, but I can always follow up with you and put you in touch with folks if needs be. But before we do go, I just wanted to say, like I said, this event is being recorded, if I haven't said that enough. So you'll have access to Lina and Sarah's insights and conversation, hopefully by tomorrow. And I will share it with you by email. So you should get an email from me probably about lunchtime tomorrow. And just to say, have a wonderful rest of your morning, afternoon, and evening, no matter what you get up to. And we're looking forward to seeing how you bring some of this work into your day-to-day life and hearing your stories. Thank you so much for everybody for attending, and lovely to see you. Take care. Bye-bye.